Hello everybody and welcome back to another stud story. We've been doing this series on Vince McMahon Jr. and this one is going to be about something that he does that actually probably is the most detrimental thing that anybody had ever done to professional wrestling. And we'll get to that in a minute. I want to go back and just remind you on the last one we talked about how Vince had taken over the territories by basically putting guys on payroll, on guarantees and contracts, which had never been done in the sport, and then taking those same guys back into territories in which they had been built by owners and different people that ran wrestling companies, and they used them against them to end up being able to put them out of business. And so this one, we're going to go in a kind of a different direction. Bear in mind that we're talking about a time frame in which Vince Jr. has gotten on NBC. He's in a position now to do business with TBS in Atlanta. He's taking over wrestling. He's beginning to close down territories in the manner in which I talked about in the last episode. And things are going good for him. He's beginning to run lots of live events, obviously, around different parts of the country, because he not necessarily, I don't believe, wanted to be there in those parts of the country, but because he wanted to kill those promoters that were in those parts of the country so that he didn't have any competition, and he would be able basically to take over the sport of wrestling. So what he did is I kind of explained how rotten the way it was of doing it. But then he realized, once he's running in all these different places in America and across the country, that there are athletic commissions. I mean, there were athletic commissions up in the Northeast where he and his father had run wrestling for many, many years. And they were usually called boxing and wrestling commissions. And basically they were set up to tax those two sports. Which was very illegal to me, always, and my father always hated them. They were all across the South, and my grandfather set up a lot of them in the South himself to protect his own companies so that he didn't have competition. He was able to put them out of business by going to the athletic commission, commissions which he had already set up for many, many years, and saying, we don't need these guys here, and then he'd get rid of them. So Vince starts going in and running these shows in all these different parts of the country, and having to deal with these athletic commissions. Normally their percentage rate was anywhere from 5 to 10% of your gross house that they would charge you. It was a very illegal tax, basically. It was just on boxing and wrestling, and those weren't the only sports being run in states across America. There was baseball, football teams, basketball teams. They just wanted to tax two sports. So in baseball, I mean, and the wrestling part of this wasn't very big. The wrestling was the monster part, and the boxing wasn't very big across the country. So most of this, once Vince got out there and he's doing these shows to put other promoters out of business, he's kind of greedy. He's getting big houses at this point. He's got a pretty good group of wrestlers, and he's got tremendous exposure. And all of a sudden, people are really talking about wrestling because there hadn't been a national wrestling program since the 1940s, and early 50s. So he's sitting in the catbird seat, and he says to himself, I don't want to pay this 10% and 5% tax that I'm having to pay on top of paying my wrestlers and paying everything else. He was obviously making good profit off of all the shows, but he got greedy. He just got darn right. I guess there's no other word for it than just he got greedy. And so, and I'm a wrestling historian in the respect that I have lived it and I have dealt with it, and I know a lot about how a lot of things happen. I'm not going to have the exact date. I don't even know for sure the state in which he decides to go and change wrestling in order to avoid this tax. I'm pretty sure it's in New Jersey, but I don't know the exact year in which it was. But I do know that eventually he ends up going to court to try to get to kill the athletic commission. And when that doesn't happen for him, he commits it's the greatest crime in wrestling. He breaks kayfabe, and for those out there, kayfabe was a word that wrestlers used to use. My grandfather, and all the way back for when it started, it's kind of a carny term in a way for carnival people. When they were running some kind of a thing in the fair and the little contest of where if you shot and you won a prize or whatever, and they wanted to talk to each other, they would talk in Kizarny. They had their own language, and kayfabe usually meant that you need to shut up because there's somebody here that you don't want to know what's going on. So that was the way wrestling was protected for 50, 60, 70 years, on up to the time that Vince goes and has to go to trial and to try to kill the athletic commission, and I think it was New Jersey. And he goes into court and he decides that, well, this is a tax against the sport. And boxing is a sport. Wrestling has always been considered a sport. And he goes, but actually, if I wanted to save that 5 or 10% every night when I run these big shows, maybe I could just go and tell them what it's all about and tell them that no, it's not a sport, that it's more of an exhibition, that it's not real, never has been real. And so that's kind of exactly what he does. Wow. If my granddad had been around and standing on the steps of that courthouse when he came out and had heard what he said, wow, I'd hate to have been Vince Jr. So what he did is he basically ended wrestling the way it was. And in one little afternoon, he just decided, and he's not just a wrestler that didn't make it or somebody that was never successful. He's the most successful wrestling promoter in the world. And he decides that I'm going to tell everybody that wrestling's not real and it never has been real because it'll save me some money. Well, it did. I guess it probably did save him a considerable amount of money because wrestling then, he was able to kill all the athletic commissions by saying, we're not a sport, we're an exhibition, and it's not real. So that's the most detrimental thing that ever happened to wrestling, in my estimation. And it was totally unnecessary. It didn't have to be done. And a lot of people that spent their life thinking that wrestling was real, found out what the real truth was. But, some wrestling, as everybody sees, and in the last couple of studcasts that I've done, my dad ended up in the hospital when he wasn't supposed to. Roy Lee Welch got his arm broken when he wasn't supposed to. There's a lot of guys got hurt in wrestling. And it might not have been what everybody thought it was, but it certainly wasn't something that you didn't get hurt in, and then what Vince did is he hurt all the wrestlers. He hurt all the business. He hurt everything. He destroyed it all to save a little money every time he ran a show. And I don't know, to me that's kind of unforgivable. And I know my grandfather would have, it would have been a bad thing for Vince Jr. to run face to face with Roy on a day like that, where he had stood and said that in a courtroom, in a court of law, knowing that it's going to go a lot further than in that courtroom, that it's going to become a big thing all across the country. It's changed the sport. And, and if I'm speaking to young people out there, you probably don't even understand the significance of it. You don't realize that wrestling was actually thought to be real at one time, and most fans believed it, and a lot of times they had right to believe it. It was very, very well done, I guess is a way to put it. But what's happened to the sport today is due entirely to Vince McMahon Jr. And he is the guy now that now when you watch your wrestling shows, they're not like the old days. And those people that go back and they watch the old school stuff, they know exactly what you're talking about. And I think the youngsters, I know a lot of times I have social media sites, and I get young people that go, wow, this is pretty much amazing stuff what y'all were doing. And it truly was amazing stuff as compared to today. We didn't have interviews that were written for us by people that never worked a single match and didn't know anything about wrestling. We didn't have storylines written by guys who are in the movie business that don't know anything about wrestling. It's a shame what's happened to the sport. And I guess that's the basic thing about this Vince series here is Vince McMahon Jr. And I don't put blame on his father. His father ran business just like everybody else was running business. But Vince McMahon Jr. had no respect for everybody else. He didn't care about anybody else. He only wanted money. He only wanted to own it all. And now he does. Basically, he is the big man. And, there are a few other organizations around. But all the old-time wrestling fans, they've lost their sport. And they're like me. I haven't watched a TV show in 20 years. I have no interest in the product today. And I hate to say that. And if things had been different, and I did talked about this in one of these earlier on this Vince series here about what might have happened had I taken the NBC show and wrestling had gone in a different direction. Wrestling today might have been absolutely monstrous. And I think a lot of the young fans out there think that wrestling now is at its height, it's a zenith. But I can only tell you, man, in the 70s and the 80s, there were 10 times the people watching wrestling that watch wrestling now. And 10 times more were going to events than they do now. There were 10 times more wrestlers than there are now. And all that passion and all that excitement about the old days wrestling, it's not here anymore. And it never will be again. And I'm very, very sorry for that. My father and my grandfather would roll over in their graves if they knew kind of what had happened to the sport that they spent so much of their life and gave so much to. And myself, I feel kind of the same way. But I appreciate everybody for joining us for these stud stories, and especially this series. And we're probably going to be doing some more later on. We're going to be, now that we're on Classics Continental, wrestling.com, and have the streaming site, we're going to be doing some tremendous stories about all types of things like this. In fact, I'm going to do one series on the sport itself, the greatest sport in the history of the world, in my estimation. I'm going to talk about the history of professional wrestling. So be sure and be joining me for that one. And thank you all so much for your continued support. And I really, really appreciate everybody out there and all the nice things you say. And I look forward to the next stud story.